Some people abuse authority because they think no one will ever challenge it. They forget that the truth has a longer memory than pride. The morning sun had barely climbed above the skyline when downtown Raleigh began to stir with its usual rhythm of courthouse employees balancing coffee cups, attorneys reviewing case files as they hurried across crosswalks, and city workers preparing for another ordinary weekday that promised nothing unusual. At least that was what everyone believed. Parked neatly along the curb outside the historic Justice Center sat a dark blue luxury sedan, perfectly within a designated parking space, its polished finish reflecting the soft golden light of early morning. A woman stepped away from the vehicle, carrying nothing more than a leather portfolio and the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years earning every ounce of respect she possessed. Vanessa Carter had learned long ago that confidence did not need to announce itself. As one of the county's most respected district attorneys, she had stood inside countless courtrooms where emotions ran high and reputations were built or destroyed with a single piece of evidence. She knew that composure often spoke louder than anger. Today, however, she was thinking only about the witness scheduled to testify in a public corruption case that had consumed months of careful preparation. She glanced toward the courthouse entrance, checked the time on her watch, and calmly locked her car before walking toward the front steps. Halfway across the sidewalk, the deep rumble of a tow truck engine echoed through the street. She slowed and turned just enough to see the truck pulling alongside her sedan. Behind it stood Officer Ethan Brooks, a veteran patrol officer whose reputation around the district was built less on professionalism than on an unwavering belief that his badge placed him beyond ordinary criticism. He folded his arms while watching the driver lower the towing equipment as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. Vanessa approached with measured steps, her expression calm rather than confrontational. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I believe there's been a mistake. That's my vehicle." Brooks barely glanced at her before replying with a dismissive shrug. "Looks like it's parked where it shouldn't be." Vanessa looked back toward the clearly marked space and then returned her attention to him. "This space is open to public parking before 8:30. I arrived less than 10 minutes ago." Brooks gave a short laugh that carried farther than necessary. "Funny, I don't remember asking for legal advice." A few pedestrians slowed their pace. A courthouse clerk standing near the entrance looked over with quiet curiosity. The tow operator hesitated for a moment, glancing between the officer and the woman, uncertain whether to continue. Vanessa reached into her portfolio without rushing and produced the parking receipt she had printed moments earlier from the city kiosk. She extended it toward Brooks. He never looked at it. "You can explain it later," he said. "Your car's being towed." The words settled over the sidewalk with surprising weight. Several people instinctively reached for their phones, not because anyone was shouting or creating a scene, but because something about the exchange felt deeply wrong. Vanessa slowly lowered the receipt, refusing to match his tone. Years inside courtrooms had taught her that frustration often clouded judgment, and judgment was something she could not afford to lose. She simply studied the officer's face for a brief moment before quietly saying, "Every decision has a record, officer. Some records last much longer than others." Brooks smirked as if the sentence amused him. The heavy steel arms of the tow truck slid beneath the sedan while traffic rolled past without slowing. Unaware that an ordinary morning had just become the first chapter of a story that would force an entire city to confront the difference between authority and accountability. The tow truck operator paused with his hands resting on the controls, looking from Officer Ethan Brooks to Vanessa Carter with growing uncertainty. Years on the job had taught him that small decisions could carry enormous consequences, especially outside the courthouse where cameras seemed to capture everything. Brooks noticed the hesitation immediately. "Finish the job," he said in a firm voice. "The vehicle is being removed." The operator nodded reluctantly and continued lifting the sedan onto the truck. Around them, more people slowed their pace. Some courthouse employees whispered quietly to one another while others simply watched in silence, unsure whether they were witnessing a routine parking dispute or something far more significant. Vanessa stood perfectly still, neither raising her voice nor stepping into the truck's path. Instead, she reached into her portfolio once more and removed a small notebook. With calm precision, she wrote the tow truck identification number, the company name printed on the driver's door, the exact time displayed on the courthouse clock, and Officer Brooks's badge number. Every movement was deliberate. Every detail mattered. Brooks noticed her writing and smiled dismissively. "Planning to write me a complaint?" he asked. Vanessa closed the notebook carefully before answering. "No, I am documenting facts." The simplicity of her reply seemed to irritate him more than any argument could have. "You lawyers always think paperwork changes reality," he muttered. Vanessa looked directly at him. "Paperwork preserves reality. That is why courts exist." Neither of them realized that a nearby college student waiting for a rideshare had already been recording the interaction from the moment the tow truck arrived. Across the street, the security cameras from 3 different office buildings pointed directly toward the curb. Above the courthouse entrance, government surveillance cameras quietly captured the same scene from another angle. None of those lenses cared about opinions. They simply recorded what happened. The sedan slowly disappeared behind the tow truck as it pulled away from the curb, leaving an empty parking space that looked strangely ordinary despite what had just occurred. Brooks adjusted his duty belt with quiet satisfaction, convinced he had proven a point. In his mind, another driver had learned to respect his authority. He never considered that authority without fairness often becomes evidence instead of protection. Vanessa watched the truck disappear around the corner. Before checking the time once more, her hearing would begin in less than 20 minutes. Without her vehicle, she could have allowed frustration to consume the morning, but instead she calmly called a rideshare, thanked the dispatcher, and continued toward the courthouse entrance. As she climbed the wide stone steps, several employees recognized her and offered concerned expressions. One clerk quietly asked whether she needed assistance. Vanessa smiled politely. "I appreciate your kindness. Right now I simply need to be on time." Inside the courthouse, the familiar sounds of footsteps, elevators, and distant conversations replaced the noise of traffic outside. She walked through security, greeted the deputies with her usual professionalism, and headed toward the courtroom without mentioning the incident to anyone. Her focus remained exactly where it had been before the tow truck arrived, the corruption case that had taken months to prepare. Yet somewhere in the back of her mind, another case had quietly begun to form. It was not built on anger or revenge. It was being built one documented fact at a time, and unlike emotions, facts had a remarkable habit of surviving long after pride had disappeared. The courtroom doors closed behind Vanessa Carter with their familiar echo, sealing away the noise from the street outside. Inside, every seat slowly filled as attorneys organized files, court reporters prepared their equipment, and spectators settled into quiet anticipation. To everyone else, it appeared to be another ordinary morning inside the justice system. Only Vanessa carried the weight of 2 completely different battles. One involved the corruption case she had spent months preparing. The other had begun less than 30 minutes earlier on the sidewalk outside. She refused to allow one to interfere with the other. When the judge entered, Vanessa stood with the same professionalism she had demonstrated throughout her career. Her voice remained steady as she presented evidence, questioned witnesses, and addressed the court with careful precision. No one watching her could have guessed that her vehicle had been taken away moments before the hearing. She never mentioned it. She never sought sympathy. She understood that credibility was built through discipline, especially when emotions offered an easier path. During a short recess, however, the story outside the courthouse quietly began to spread. The college student who had recorded the encounter uploaded a brief video to a social media account with a simple caption asking whether the towing had been justified. Within minutes, local residents started recognizing the courthouse entrance in the background. Some questioned the officer's decision. Others wondered why the woman had remained so calm despite obvious frustration. More importantly, several people who had witnessed the exchange added comments describing exactly what they had seen. None of them exaggerated. They simply described the facts. At the same time, inside the police department, Officer Ethan Brooks finished his paperwork with complete confidence. He entered routine information into the towing report and checked the appropriate boxes without giving the incident another thought. To him, it had been another interaction with someone he believed needed to be reminded that officers made the final decisions on the street. He never considered how closely every statement on that report might one day be compared with multiple camera angles, independent witnesses, electronic records, and his own body camera footage. Confidence built on assumptions often collapses the moment facts begin asking questions. Shortly after the morning hearing concluded, Vanessa walked into her office carrying the same leather portfolio she had held all day. Her executive assistant immediately noticed that she had arrived without her car. "Is everything all right?" she asked quietly. Vanessa smiled with calm professionalism before placing her notebook on the desk. "Everything will be. I need copies of the parking regulations for the courthouse district, the towing authorization policy, and the city's enforcement procedures." The assistant looked surprised but nodded without hesitation. There was no anger in Vanessa's voice, no desire for retaliation. She wanted only the official rules exactly as they existed. Nothing more, nothing less. As the requested documents began arriving one by one, she carefully compared each policy with her own handwritten notes from the sidewalk. Times matched, locations matched, parking hours matched. The receipt she had purchased that morning remained valid. She quietly highlighted several passages before placing every document into a separate folder labeled only with the date. Looking through her office window toward the courthouse across the street, she reflected on something her late father had often told her when she was still in law school. The strongest case is never the loudest one. It is the one that leaves no room for doubt. Vanessa closed the folder without a trace of satisfaction. This was no longer about recovering a vehicle or proving someone wrong. It had become something much larger. Somewhere beyond the courthouse walls, more cameras, more witnesses, and more official records were waiting to tell exactly the same story, and the truth was beginning to assemble itself without anyone needing to raise their voice. By late afternoon, the courthouse had returned to its familiar rhythm, but outside its walls the quiet video recorded that morning had begun reaching thousands of people across the city. There was no dramatic music, no sensational editing, and no commentary telling viewers what to believe. The recording simply showed a composed woman presenting a valid parking receipt, while an officer declined to examine it before authorizing the tow. The absence of shouting made the scene even more unsettling. People watched it once, then replayed it, noticing details they had missed the first time. They noticed the marked public parking signs. They noticed the timestamp on the receipt. They noticed that the woman never interrupted, never argued, and never stepped beyond respectful professionalism. Questions started appearing beneath the video faster than answers. Why was the receipt ignored? Why was the tow ordered so quickly? Had department policy actually been followed? Meanwhile, Officer Ethan Brooks finished his shift believing the incident had already disappeared into another routine workday. A few coworkers casually mentioned that someone had posted a courthouse video online, but Brooks dismissed the conversation with a confident smile. "People record everything these days," he said. "By tomorrow they will have forgotten about it." He believed experience was on his side. After years in uniform, he had grown comfortable assuming that public attention always moved on before difficult questions reached official desks. What he failed to recognize was that this situation was unfolding differently. Instead of emotional arguments, people were sharing city ordinances, parking maps, and department regulations. The conversation was becoming less about opinions and more about documented facts. Across town, Vanessa Carter remained inside her office long after many lights in the building had gone dark. The folder on her desk continued to grow thicker. Certified parking regulations rested beside municipal towing policies. Public records requests had already been submitted for dispatch communications, body camera footage, and the official authorization supporting the tow. Every request followed established legal procedures. Every document was organized chronologically. She was not searching for a mistake. She was allowing the evidence to answer that question on its own. Her assistant looked toward the growing stack of files before quietly asking, "Are you planning to file something?" Vanessa paused before answering. "Not until I understand every fact. Justice should never move faster than the truth." Those words reflected the principle that had guided her entire career. Winning had never been her goal. Accuracy had. At nearly the same moment, the towing company completed its internal paperwork and uploaded photographs taken before removing the vehicle. Company policy required images documenting the condition and location of every automobile before transport. The employees involved considered it nothing more than routine procedure. None of them realized their own records would soon become another independent piece of a much larger puzzle. By early evening, local journalists began contacting city officials requesting comments about the growing public discussion. The police department issued a brief statement explaining that the matter would be reviewed according to normal procedures. It sounded ordinary, almost automatic. Yet behind those carefully chosen words, supervisors quietly requested copies of reports that had received little attention only hours earlier. Inside headquarters, a lieutenant compared the incident report with the initial public questions already circulating online. Small inconsistencies began attracting attention. Nothing conclusive, nothing dramatic, just enough to justify looking a little closer. As the sun disappeared beyond the city skyline, Vanessa finally closed the folder and turned off the light in her office. She knew the real battle had not yet begun. Public attention could fade overnight, but official records did not. Cameras did not forget. Policies did not change themselves. And when every independent piece of evidence eventually pointed toward the same conclusion, no amount of confidence would be able to argue with the quiet weight of documented truth. The following morning began with a silence that felt almost deceptive. Outside, commuters hurried through downtown without realizing that dozens of independent events had quietly started moving toward the same destination. Inside the city records office, requests submitted by Vanessa Carter the previous afternoon were already being processed according to standard procedure. No special treatment, no shortcuts. Every request entered the same public system available to any citizen. That was exactly how she wanted it. She understood that transparency carried far more weight than influence. Shortly after 8 o'clock, an email notification appeared in her inbox confirming that the dispatch log connected to the towing incident had been released. She opened the document carefully, reading every line without rushing. The timestamps immediately caught her attention. The request for the tow had been entered only moments after Officer Ethan Brooks first arrived at the location. According to department procedures, officers were expected to verify the parking violation before requesting removal unless immediate public safety concerns existed. There had been no emergency, no blocked roadway, no disabled access violation, no temporary restriction. She compared the dispatch times with the receipt from the parking kiosk. The receipt had been purchased before the tow request was entered. Vanessa quietly placed another yellow tab inside the growing folder. She still was not drawing conclusions. She was simply allowing each document to find its proper place. Later that morning, another response arrived. The City Transportation Office released photographs showing the official parking signs exactly as they appeared that day. Every sign confirmed the same public parking hours listed in the municipal code. Nothing about the location suggested that towing had been required. Even more revealing was the digital payment record generated by the parking meter system. It verified not only the payment amount, but also the exact minute the parking session became active. Technology had no personal opinion. It merely preserved facts. Meanwhile, at police headquarters, Internal Affairs quietly requested Officer Brooks's body camera footage as part of the routine review mentioned in the department's public statement. Brooks remained unconcerned when he received the notice. Reviews happened from time to time, and he believed his written report accurately reflected the situation. What he could not remember with complete certainty were the dozens of small statements he had made before activating and after deactivating portions of his equipment. Human memory often edits itself over time. Digital recordings never do. Across the street from the courthouse, the owner of a small coffee shop noticed investigators requesting access to the security cameras mounted above his entrance. He gladly cooperated, explaining that the cameras automatically stored high-definition video for 30 days. Another business owner did the same. Then another. Without realizing it, each person contributed another angle, another timestamp, another neutral witness incapable of forgetting or changing its story. By the end of the afternoon, Vanessa spread the documents and printed images across the conference table in her office. Her assistant looked at the growing collection and quietly observed. Every source is telling the same story. Vanessa nodded thoughtfully before responding. That is when evidence becomes difficult to ignore. She gathered the papers into a single organized binder, each section supported by independent documentation that neither depended upon nor contradicted the others. There was still no lawsuit, no public accusation, no dramatic announcement, only a steadily growing record built on patience, procedure, and verifiable facts. Somewhere across town, Officer Brooks finished another ordinary shift believing the questions surrounding the incident would soon disappear. He had no way of knowing that while he spent the day enforcing rules on the streets, the rules themselves were quietly assembling a case that would eventually examine every decision he had made on that seemingly ordinary morning. 3 days after the incident, the quiet collection of documents reached a turning point. Vanessa Carter sat across a polished conference table from attorney Marcus Ellis, one of the city's most respected civil litigation attorneys. The thick binder she placed in front of him contained no speculation, no emotional statements, and no dramatic conclusions. Every page consisted of official records, certified policies, photographs, timestamps, witness statements, or publicly obtained documents. Marcus spent nearly an hour reviewing the material without interruption. Occasionally he adjusted his glasses or made a brief note in the margin, but he never hurried. When he finally closed the binder, he remained silent for several moments before speaking. "You did not build this around anger," he said. Vanessa calmly folded her hands on the table. "Anger fades. Evidence does not." Marcus nodded slowly. "That may be the strongest decision you made." Together they discussed every possible legal path. Vanessa made one point unmistakably clear from the beginning. She did not want anyone to believe her public position entitled her to different treatment than any other citizen. The lawsuit, if filed, would not seek special privileges. It would focus entirely on whether established procedures had been ignored and whether those actions caused measurable harm. Marcus agreed. Completely. The integrity of the case depended upon fairness, not influence. During the following week, formal preservation notices were delivered to the city, the police department, the towing company, and every organization known to possess relevant records. The notices required that electronic evidence, reports, videos, emails, dispatch communications, and internal documents connected to the incident be preserved exactly as they existed. Routine document destruction policies immediately stopped. Every digital file now became part of a growing legal record. At police headquarters, supervisors recognized that the matter had entered a far more serious stage. Captain Daniel Ross personally reviewed the initial incident report alongside department policy manuals. Several passages immediately raised difficult questions. Procedures that officers completed almost automatically every day suddenly demanded closer examination. Ross requested additional interviews with dispatch personnel, towing company representatives, and officers who had been working nearby that morning. No accusations were made. No conclusions were announced. The review simply continued expanding as each answer generated another question. Meanwhile, local news organizations obtained confirmation that a formal legal claim had been filed against the city. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse hoping to speak with Vanessa as she finished another day of hearings. Cameras followed her as she walked down the courthouse steps carrying the same leather portfolio that had become familiar to everyone watching the story unfold. A reporter called out, "Are you filing this because you are the district attorney?" Vanessa stopped briefly and answered with complete composure. "No, I am filing it because every person deserves decisions based on policy instead of assumptions. The law should protect public trust, and accountability protects the law." She thanked the reporters and continued walking without answering additional questions. Her statement spread quickly across television broadcasts and online platforms because it avoided personal attacks entirely. It focused instead on principles larger than any individual. Across town, Officer Ethan Brooks watched the interview from the break room television inside the precinct. For the first time since that morning outside the courthouse, confidence gave way to uncertainty. He realized this was no longer about a single towing decision. Every report he had written, every statement he had made, every recorded moment from that day was now part of a legal process that would examine facts with the same patience and precision that Vanessa Carter had demonstrated from the very beginning. Several months later, the case entered the stage where every assumption would either survive the evidence or collapse beneath it. The hearing room was quiet long before the proceedings officially began. Attorneys organized exhibits while court staff tested presentation equipment and verified the chain of custody for every document that would appear on the record. Nothing inside the room relied on rumor anymore. Every statement now required proof. Vanessa Carter sat beside attorney Marcus Ellis with the same calm expression she had carried since the morning her vehicle had been removed. She had never asked the public to believe her version of events. She had simply asked the court to examine the facts. Across the aisle, representatives for the city reviewed their own files with growing concern. Officer Ethan Brooks remained seated behind counsel, his earlier confidence replaced by careful silence. He understood that this day would not be decided by personality, reputation, or emotion. It would be decided by records that could neither forget nor exaggerate. The first exhibit displayed on the courtroom screen was the certified parking regulation for the block where Vanessa had left her vehicle. Next came the official city map identifying the public parking zone and its permitted hours. The timestamps matched perfectly with the digital payment receipt generated by the parking system. Then the dispatch records appeared, establishing the precise moment the tow request had been entered. The sequence unfolded one document at a time, each independent record confirming the one before it. No single exhibit carried the entire case. Together they formed a timeline that became increasingly difficult to dispute. Attorney Marcus Ellis spoke with deliberate restraint, allowing the evidence to carry the weight instead of dramatic language. He reminded the court that procedures existed to ensure consistency, fairness, and public confidence. The issue before the court was not whether officers possessed authority. It was whether that authority had been exercised according to established rules. Then came the videos. First, the courthouse security footage showed Vanessa calmly approaching Officer Brooks while holding her valid parking receipt. Next, a nearby business camera captured the same interaction from another angle. Finally, the body camera recording began playing. The courtroom remained completely silent as every spoken word unfolded exactly as it had on that ordinary morning. There were no raised voices from Vanessa, no refusal to cooperate, and no attempt to interfere with the towing process. She presented documentation. She asked respectful questions. She documented the encounter. The recordings revealed something else as well. Opportunities to verify the parking receipt had existed before the tow proceeded, yet those opportunities had not been taken. The courtroom grew even quieter when the timelines from every recording aligned almost to the second. Judge Eleanor Hayes leaned forward, carefully reviewing the synchronized exhibits while making detailed notes. During cross-examination, Officer Brooks was asked to explain how his written report fit alongside the dispatch log, the parking receipt, the municipal regulations, and the multiple recordings. His answers became increasingly measured as each response was compared against another independent document. No one interrupted him. No one argued with him. The evidence simply continued speaking in its own consistent voice. By the end of the afternoon, it became clear that the case had evolved far beyond a disagreement over a single towing decision. The proceedings now examined whether public authority had been exercised with fairness, whether established procedures had been followed, and whether accountability required more than good intentions. As the final exhibit was removed from the screen, the silence inside the courtroom carried a different meaning than it had at the beginning of the day. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence that arrives when documented truth leaves very little room for doubt. When the hearing resumed the following week, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had changed completely. There was no longer any debate about what had happened outside the courthouse that morning months earlier. The documents, videos, dispatch records, certified policies, and witness testimony had established a consistent sequence of events that neither side could meaningfully dispute. The only question remaining was what accountability required when public authority had been exercised outside established procedure. Judge Eleanor Hayes entered the courtroom, reviewed her notes one final time, and began reading her findings with careful precision. Every sentence reflected the evidence presented over the previous weeks. She emphasized that the court was not judging the value of law enforcement as a profession, nor questioning the difficult responsibilities officers carried every day. Instead, the court was examining whether one officer had fulfilled those responsibilities within the limits established by law. Public trust, she explained, depended upon consistent application of those rules regardless of who stood on either side of an encounter. After summarizing the documentary evidence, the synchronized recordings, and the testimony presented by both parties, the court concluded that the towing decision had not complied with the governing procedures applicable at the time. The written report, when compared with the objective evidence, failed to accurately reflect several critical facts established during the hearing. Those findings carried consequences extending beyond the disputed tow itself because public records formed the foundation upon which citizens relied when evaluating official conduct. The court entered judgment in Vanessa Carter's favor and awarded damages designed not to create personal gain, but to compensate for the measurable losses caused by the improper actions. More importantly, the ruling ordered the city to reimburse legal expenses and implement additional policy training to reduce the likelihood of similar incidents occurring in the future. The courtroom remained silent as the decision was read. No celebration followed. No emotional outbursts interrupted the proceedings. Vanessa simply listened, her expression unchanged from the day she first documented the incident in her notebook. Attorney Marcus Ellis quietly closed his case file before extending his hand. "The evidence spoke exactly as it should," he said. Vanessa nodded gently. "That is all I ever wanted." Outside the courtroom, city officials released a statement acknowledging the judgment and confirming that internal administrative reviews had also reached their conclusion. Captain Daniel Ross later informed Officer Ethan Brooks that the department had determined his conduct violated multiple professional standards governing discretion, documentation, and procedural compliance. The disciplinary process resulted in the termination of his employment, and the state's certification board opened a separate review regarding his eligibility to continue serving as a law enforcement officer. Brooks accepted the written notice without argument. For the first time, he appeared to understand that the consequences had not been created by public criticism or media attention. They had grown directly from decisions he alone had made, each one carefully preserved by records he never imagined would someday be examined together. In the weeks that followed, the city revised portions of its towing oversight procedures, expanded documentation requirements, and introduced additional training emphasizing impartial enforcement and proper verification before authorizing vehicle removals. What had begun as a single incident involving one parked car gradually became an opportunity for institutional improvement. Looking back, many people realized the case had never truly been about a vehicle or a parking space. It had been about whether authority could remain worthy of public confidence when challenged by documented truth. On that question, the evidence had provided an answer that would remain part of the public record long after every headline had disappeared. Several months passed before life in downtown Raleigh settled into a familiar rhythm again, yet traces of that single morning remained visible in ways few people expected. New towing verification procedures became standard practice. Officers received additional training emphasizing documentation, impartial decision-making, and careful review before exercising discretionary authority. City employees who had quietly watched the case unfold often spoke about it not as a scandal, but as a reminder that public confidence was built one decision at a time. Vanessa Carter never referred to the case as her greatest victory. In fact, she rarely mentioned it at all. She returned to the same courtroom where she had spent years serving the public, arriving each morning with the same leather portfolio, the same quiet professionalism, and the same commitment to applying the law fairly regardless of who stood before her. Colleagues occasionally asked whether she felt satisfied with how everything had ended. Her answer never changed. Justice is not about making someone lose. It is about making the system worthy of public trust. Those words spread throughout the legal community because they reflected something many people had nearly forgotten. Accountability was not punishment for its own sake. It was the process that protected honest public servants along with the citizens they served. Captain Daniel Ross often reflected on the internal review that followed the incident. During training sessions for newly assigned officers, he reminded them that every badge represented authority granted by the community, not authority owned by the individual wearing it. He never mentioned names. He simply described how small decisions, overlooked procedures, or assumptions made in a single moment could eventually define an entire career. The lesson resonated because it came from documented reality rather than theory. Across the city, the coffee shop owner whose security camera had quietly preserved part of the encounter eventually removed the newspaper clipping that had hung beside the register for several weeks. Customers had stopped talking about the lawsuit, but they continued discussing fairness, professionalism, and respect whenever public service became part of the conversation. Even the college student, whose brief recording first attracted public attention, admitted during a local interview that the experience had changed how she viewed accountability. She realized that recording events was only the beginning. The real difference came from allowing evidence to be examined carefully instead of rushing toward conclusions. One autumn afternoon, nearly a year after everything began, Vanessa parked her vehicle only a few feet from the same curb where the tow truck had once arrived. The parking signs remained unchanged, but something else had changed completely. An officer walking his downtown patrol noticed her approaching the meter and politely greeted her before continuing on his way. It was an ordinary exchange, lasting only a few seconds, yet it represented the kind of quiet professionalism that rarely became headlines because it was exactly what the public deserved every day. Vanessa paused for a brief moment before looking toward the courthouse entrance where the entire journey had begun. She remembered the notebook in which she had written badge numbers, timestamps, and observations instead of responding with anger. At the time, those simple notes had seemed almost insignificant. Looking back, they had become the first pages of a record that demonstrated how patience, integrity, and documented truth could accomplish what outrage alone never could. As she walked toward the courthouse once again, the morning sunlight reflected softly across the stone steps just as it had on that first day, but this time the path ahead felt lighter. The lesson left behind was simple enough for every citizen and every public servant to remember. Authority may command attention for a moment, but character earns respect over a lifetime. And when truth is carefully preserved, justice does not need to raise its voice because it will always find its way to those willing to follow the facts.